welcome to Politics Theory Other. The recently concluded summit in Beijing between the United States and the People's Republic of China was the occasion of the first visit to the PRC of a sitting US president for nearly a decade, and took place in the wake of years of deteriorating relations across both the Trump and Biden presidencies. Although expectations for the summit were not especially high, the outcomes were even more insubstantial than many had predicted. But the summit did at least reveal that for the time being, relations between the Trump administration and Xi Jinping and the PRC are on a somewhat more friendly footing than at the height of the tariff war. In today's interview, I spoke with China experts Tobita Chow and Jake Werner about whether or not the relative thaw in relations and the continuation of the tariff truce is durable. We went on to talk about China's approach to Taiwan and how realistic or otherwise the idea of a Chinese blockade or military assault on the island really are. And Jake and Toby explained what they see as potential crises on the horizon that might worsen relations between the two most powerful states in the global system. If you find this interview useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PTO going, you'll also get access to bonus content. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/Pole Theory Other to sign up. Tobita Chow is a researcher and organizer based in the Chicago area. His work addresses the US-China relationship, the future of the global economy, and climate change. His articles have appeared in The Guardian, The Nation, In These Times, and elsewhere. Jake Werner is director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute and is also a co-founder of Justice is Global, a grassroots organizing project that advocates for reforms to the global economy. And he is also a co-founder of Critical China Scholars, a network of academics engaged in public education on Chinese politics and society. The US-China relationship is, of course, the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and meetings between leaders of the two nations have at times been hugely consequential. Richard Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1972 being the most dramatic example, of course. But the observable outcomes of Trump's trip to Beijing seem at this point in time to be relatively inconsequential. So China has agreed to purchase 25 million tons of US soy and some other agricultural products, and will also purchase 200 Boeing airplanes, although the share price of the rather troubled aircraft manufacturer is actually down today because a larger order that had been talked of hasn't been confirmed. There's been no announcement on AI. There's been very little on export controls on US sales of chips to China or Chinese curbs on American access to rare earths. And although there have been conciliatory words, there's been nothing substantial on the Strait of Hormuz. And finally, we've seen no revision of the US position on Taiwan, despite much prior speculation that the US might make a shift, at least at the rhetorical level, with the Chinese hoping that the US posture would shift from not supporting Taiwan's independence to actively opposing it. Is the significance of the talks then really more to do with the fact that the two sides are, at least for the moment, still able to remain in dialogue with each other, that the tariff truce continues for now, and that we don't currently see the levels of tension and hostility that we did earlier in the administration at the height of the tariff war, or indeed during the Biden administration when military tensions reached a genuinely dangerous high point around the time of the Chinese balloon incident. So if we start with you, Toby, would you agree with that? Could we say that the vibes, as it were, are where the significance of the summit lies, rather than the detail and the substance, which, as I say, does seem to be relatively insubstantial?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say that the consequences of the summit are mainly about the vibes. Another way of putting that is that it's kind of anticlimactic. And there were some, I feel like, a lot of overheated takes on what the outcomes might be. Some dismayed, some maybe sort of optimistic, depending on what your priors are. But yeah, I think not a whole lot happened that substantially changes the relationship. It is notable that, like others have noted, that the readouts from the US side and the Chinese side sometimes sound like they're about two different meetings, which basically means that each side is leaving the other free to sort of spin it in whatever positive light that suits their purposes. And maybe that's fine. It does mean a continuation of the truce that was established last fall. And that's pretty good. As far as that goes, it's sort of like no news is good news, in my opinion.
Yeah, Jake, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it demonstrates continuity with the Xi Jinping Trump meeting from late October last year. So the kind of truce that the two settled on at that meeting seems to have continued. And I guess with Trump, if you have continuity, that's in itself kind of newsworthy because he could change his mind at any time. So I think it is significant that the kind of, very fragile stability that was established through a series of crazy roller coaster rides last year seems to still be in place. The other thing that I would point to is just the way that the U.S. foreign policy establishment was talking about this summit and the sort of hand-wringing around the fact that Trump was not taking a highly confrontational line. I think that's noteworthy in itself as well, and it tells you how far the relationship has to go to get off of the kind of toxic track that it has been on for a number of years now.
And is it not merely a problem of intent and divergence of objectives and hostility, but also just a lack of capacity in the sense that the Trump administration sort of demolished the existing diplomatic relationship that there had been under Obama and George W. Bush. And so it may be that there's just not really the ability to pull off at this point in time more substantial agreements.
I think that's right. As you said, the first Trump administration ripped apart a very well-elaborated diplomatic structure that was in place, and the Biden administration didn't really put that back together at all. And of course, the second Trump administration is even less interested in process and detailed negotiations. But we see that in every case. It's certainly been true on the China relationship as well. The question, I guess, is whether that gets put in place subsequent to this visit or not. And I think there is a possibility there because the U.S. talked about a board of trade that would manage the trade relationship, a board of investment that could facilitate the movement of Chinese capital into the United States and overcome some of the obstacles that have been put up over the last 10 years to that. Those agreements, if they're to produce any fruit, would really need some detailed lower level negotiating capacity. And if they put that in place, then what Trump has talked about is potentially 4 meetings with Xi Jinping this year. So if they have that kind of apparatus in place, we could see some real progress down the road, even though we haven't seen much of anything this time.
Toby, going back to the question of the significance of the summit, is one way in which the summit actually could be seen as being very significant that it perhaps marks the moment where we are approaching true parity between the two states, even if that power is not symmetrical in the sense of the US maintaining military supremacy while China is primarily an economic and technological power. And that especially in the wake of the Iran war, it feels like China has never been in a stronger position vis-a-vis the United States. Would you agree with that? Do you see the relationship as really quite different from how it was even a few years ago?
I do think that the tenor of the relationship right now has changed significantly from what it was a few years ago. A lot of that, though, I feel like is connected not to any sort of new structural parity between the US and China, but it has a lot to do with Trump's just like idiosyncratic character structure. Things feel more stable now. The tensions feel maybe more manageable, but a lot of this has to do with the fact that China instituted these restrictions on rare earths exports, and Trump saw that as a very effective form of China hitting back at him and a form of strength on China's part. And, he seems to just respect strength, and he could see Xi Jinping as like a fellow strongman or something like that. So now he wants to be buddy-buddy with him as, like a peer. But yeah, that's a very unstable basis for saying like there's a new phase in the US-China relationship. The question of parity is, it took me a while to wrap my head around that because it involves comparing things I'm not sure are like really commensurable. And just like the way that China thinks about its place in the world is just very different from the way that the US does. So yeah, I don't know, it's hard for me to sort of compare.
And sorry, on its place in the world, would you say that's about China, although obviously wanting to be, perhaps a more powerful actor in the world and to perhaps exert more power in its own region, that it doesn't seek to be a global hegemon in the way that the United States is, right? It doesn't seek to replace the United States.
Yeah, that's right. That's part of it. China continues to have no aspirations to global hegemony. I think it may even be overstating it to say that they have aspirations to regional hegemony, in the sense that if you think of hegemony as involving like a sense of responsibility for affairs globally or even regionally, I'm not sure China's even at the point where they're trying to establish regional hegemony.
Yes, and the way in which China very visibly avoids entangling itself in any sort of alliance building would be the most obvious example of that, I suppose. Jake, anything to add on that?
I think there is something real there, that the fact that for many years now, the United States was engaged in various forms of economic warfare and attempts to prevent China from developing, at least in high-tech sectors. And China didn't really fight back very hard on that. Chinese leaders consistently said this is violating our right to development. It's violating international law often. But they didn't really take strong countermeasures until the fallout from Liberation Day last year. And that, I think, was not because, so some alums of the Biden administration have said that's because Trump is weak, because they knew that they could take advantage of Trump and he would give in. And if we had been in power, that never would have happened. I think that's completely wrong. What happened is that the sort of tech warfare really started under the first Trump administration with the attacks on Huawei, the attempts to destroy Huawei, which was very close to successful. And then the Biden administration came in and tried to systematize that. They put in place a systematic blockade on advanced semiconductors and progressively expanded it. China was not ready for that. China was not expecting those kinds of restrictions. I think it took China by surprise, the fact that the United States had pretty abruptly concluded that China needed to be forcibly suppressed technologically.
Yeah, I suppose they might have expected some sort of reversion to a less confrontational approach to China from the Biden administration after the Trump administration.
I think there was that hope. I'm not sure to what extent they were relying on it. But it really was a new departure in U.S. foreign policy to target a specific country. That was new. To target a primarily civilian technology, even though on pretext that it was for military uses, but to say we have to wipe out China's access to this particular primarily civilian technology that we believe is the basis of future growth in the economy, but must be denied to China. That was also new. So I think it really did take Chinese leaders by surprise, and it took them some time to put together the apparatus to fight back. But that's what they did over the course of the Biden years, is they put together a legal and bureaucratic, and they gathered the information and built the capacities to weaponize their control over rare earth elements in the same way that the United States was weaponizing its, via intellectual property, its control over advanced technology. And by the very end of the Biden administration, China was then ready to start employing these tools, which they did right after the 2024 election in a limited way. But they didn't really roll out the full power of it until the Trump Liberation Day tariffs. And I think whether Harris were in office or Trump being in office, all of them would have to contend with the fact that China now has an ability to really hurt the United States in the way that the United States had been hurting China almost with impunity up to that point. And then the question is whether these Biden alums who are looking at the way that Trump responded to that, which was to back down in order to gain access to rare earth exports that are necessary for a lot of important American industrial sectors, He backed down. They said Trump shouldn't have backed down. He should have escalated it all the way towards a really open confrontation with China. I don't know if they would have done that if they were the ones making the decisions, but they would have had to make that decision because I think China would have used these powers one way or the other. It wasn't specifically because Trump was in office that they used them. And so I think that does give a new tenor to the relationship. And more or less what has happened first at the Busan meeting last year and now at the Beijing meeting is that Trump at least has recognized that China has that power over the United States. I'm not sure if the rest of the foreign policy establishment is willing to recognize that, but it is something that I think will have to be a factor from now on.
Jake, you've written recently on the effects of the US tariff wall on American business and research and development. And you've argued that the competitive edge of US technology is likely to be blunted as American companies can live off of the captive US market and neglect innovation that would be needed to compete with Chinese firms if tariffs were reduced. And there's perhaps shades in that argument of what the captive market of the British Empire did to British industry at its own moment of imperial decline. Can you expand on that argument a bit? And how sensitive do you think American capital is to that threat to their long-term prospects, even if they're able to remain highly profitable in the short to medium term?
I think it varies by sector. And some of the sectors that I had in mind in writing about this were sectors that China has clearly taken a lead. Chinese companies have clearly taken a lead, like electric vehicles, like batteries, like industrial robots. A lot of multinational American companies, they have access to and exposure to Chinese competition outside of the American market. So it really depends on how deeply they're stuck in the US as a market. But to the extent that they can't find ways to feel the force of Chinese competition or gain access to the kinds of technical knowledge and the kinds of research that is ongoing on the Chinese side, that means they're going to fall behind. And many of them will be quite comfortable with the gigantic American market that will, for many years still, even if it continues to sort of fall apart in the way that it has been in recent decades, will continue to be the world's largest economy. And so they may be quite comfortable behind tariff barriers that protect them from Chinese competition. But that does mean that increasingly, at least in some of these sectors, the United States will start to fall behind China and the rest of the world that has these advanced sectors, that is finding ways to incorporate Chinese competition and Chinese investment, gain access to Chinese know-how, and look for technology transfer like the EU is exploring now. So my suggestion was that the United States, for its own self-interest, as much as for any hope of getting us off a path to great power conflict, could explore a new way to connect with China that would incorporate Chinese competition, Chinese investment, and gain access to these advances that otherwise they will lose sight of.
And I suppose that point about the response of other nations, I mean, perhaps the EU is a separate case, but in general, I suppose smaller nations just don't have the option of sheltering behind tariff rules, right? Because they do not have, a sort of continental-sized economy to which to sell. Let's turn to Taiwan for a moment. So, Toby, despite the rather ambivalent statements that Trump has made about Taiwan, we haven't, as I mentioned at the top, seen a notable shift in the US position. Is that likely just a reflection of Trump's own position and that he's actually more committed to the US relationship with Taiwan than is sometimes supposed? Or is it perhaps more due to the influence of the views of the more hawkish and anti-China members of his administration, although some of the China hawks have been sidelined in recent months?
Yeah, what to make of what Trump thinks about this? I'm
Or
not
anything.
entirely sure. Yeah, right. It does seem like, I mean, Trump is certainly entirely willing to throw out, ignore, flaunt decades of diplomatic and foreign policy practice, which, understandably makes the U.S. foreign policy establishment extremely nervous. And it at times has seemed like he is entirely willing to make a grand bargain with China that includes granting them something around Taiwan. So, yeah, what is he actually open to? That's unclear. But I think there's reason to think that he would be willing to move things in a very different direction. It is true that he is surrounded by advisors in personnel and his own administration that do not want to see him make any significant concessions around Taiwan. So he's probably getting an earful of that on a regular basis, I'm guessing. At the moment, I think I saw some reports just recently that he said that he did discuss U.S. arms sales to Taiwan with Xi Jinping in one of these recent media interviews, which would be a break from established diplomatic practice and a violation of the six assurances. And he seemed to not think that that was a big deal. But basically every foreign policy expert in the U.S. would disagree with that.
There was a recent long essay in Foreign Affairs on Taiwan that you may have both seen that made the case that the prospect of China taking military action to gain control of Taiwan is currently very low, and that the Chinese leadership believe that their sort of gradualist strategy of bringing Taiwan back into the fold through a sort of combination of diplomacy, fostering deeper economic ties, and Beijing has this concept of what it calls integrated development, a suite of policies that are aimed at attracting businesses from Taiwan in the hopes of deepening economic dependence and social integration. And that all of this, along with the more sort of low-key military pressure that we see, will therefore mean that there'll be no need for direct military escalation, especially as US power in the region gradually declines. Would you agree with that kind of perspective? If we start with you, Jake.
Yeah, I think that's basically right. I was in China a couple of weeks ago speaking with members of the foreign policy community, and they made this point that in the meeting with Trump, Xi Jinping certainly would bring up Taiwan, but less on the hopes of changing the U.S. position on it or getting a grand bargain or something, and rather just sort of planting the flag and reminding the United States that this is the single most important thing to the Chinese leadership. Because the feeling was after the Busan meeting, when Taiwan apparently did not come up or was a very minor issue, that then the United States felt free to go ahead with this record-breaking arms sale at the end of the year. And the United States really had to be reminded about this and, sort of a brushback pitch. But the expectation that the United States would change its policy or come to a grand bargain is simply not there on the Chinese side. And even if it were, they don't trust Trump to keep his word. And even if he did, they don't trust the larger American ecosystem to support any kind of new orientation towards Taiwan. And I think the reason that they're willing to tolerate where the United States has been and sort of maintaining this basic ambiguous status quo that has eroded in recent years as the U.S.-China relationship has deteriorated, but it's still in place. The reason that they're open to that is precisely because they think that things are going in their direction, as you say. And that was in some sense confirmed for them by the recent visit of the Kuomintang leader. So the Kuomintang is the main opposition party in Taiwan. And the leader of the Kuomintang, a woman named Zheng Liwen, visited Beijing. This is the first time that a Taiwanese political leader has visited Beijing in many years, at least a currently serving one, and had a meeting with Xi Jinping. And it was all very friendly. And the Kuomintang is the party that at least nominally supports unification with the mainland at some point.
Despite themselves being the sort of the legatees of the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang obviously was one of the belligerents in the Chinese Civil War.
Right. Yes. All kinds of historical ironies where the Communist Party's best friends on Taiwan now are the Kuomintang. And there's been some
they've
very
been
funny...
friends before, right? But
well, yes. Those previous friendships didn't work out very well for the Communist Party at the time.
Yeah.
They might be hoping for something different this time around. But I think it's worth they might be getting overconfident now. So the thing that I worry about is that the Chinese leadership is like, okay, the Kuomintang is on the upswing. The current president of Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, is very unpopular. He's sort of the bête noire for the Chinese leadership. So he's very unpopular. They did these elections last year where they tried to recall a bunch of Kuomintang legislators and basically all of them failed. So he's kind of on the back foot. There was trouble passing military increase. It eventually did go through, but there was a lot of trouble passing it through the legislature. So I think the Chinese leadership is probably feeling very good about the direction things are going. And maybe the Kuomintang candidate will win the next presidential election in 28. But I think that the fact that more independence-oriented forces in Taiwan are weakening does not translate by any means into a sense within Taiwanese politics that we would be delighted to move towards unification with the mainland. And I think it's probably hard for Chinese leaders to understand that. The concern then is that they get overconfident and disappointed. And sometimes disappointment after overconfidence is a more destabilizing dynamic than simply having low expectations all along. So I think for now, we're in a pretty safe place on Taiwan. Looking down the road then, and this should also be connected to domestic Taiwanese politics in the way that China trying to cultivate business interests in Taiwan has counterproductive effects in Taiwanese politics from their perspective, because a big part of the anti-China feeling comes from a sense that China is on the side of the business elite in Taiwan, which it is, because the business elite is that part of Taiwanese businesses that is invested in China and making a lot of money from exploiting Chinese labor. So there are a lot of complicating dynamics here that don't come through in the way that this story is usually framed, which is just like China wants to conquer this island, the United States wants to prevent it, who's up, who's down. That doesn't get at the actual drivers of the conflict. It doesn't get to the source of the conflict. It doesn't get to the dynamics that will ultimately decide where things go. So I think it's just important to flag that to understand where this might go.
Yeah, I think the whole political economy of the China-Taiwan-US dynamic is almost always lost in mainstream discourse and just leads to a lot of misunderstandings. That foreign affairs article that you mentioned, I was largely in agreement with a lot of the points that they made there. I think it is important for progressives in the US in particular to push back against this fairly dominant narrative that PRC attack on Taiwan is just around the corner, or that China's leaders are just looking for the right opportunity to strike and will seize it once they see that opportunity. I think that's just not the way that they're thinking about their path to what they call peaceful reunification. Yeah, it also ignores that the things that deter China from military attack, military deterrence is part of that, but there are other really significant things that they have to consider, like what the economic blowback of that would be, and the economic and diplomatic blowback. And the idea that they would risk that anytime soon is just not that plausible at the moment.
On the question of economic blowback, I mean, obviously a major factor would be the global dominance of Taiwan's chip manufacturers. But in 2025, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent warned that Taiwan represented the single greatest point of failure for the world economy because of the presence of the fabs. And earlier this year, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick called for Taiwan to move 40% of its chip production to the United States. Does that raise the prospect of US commitment to Taiwan's defense eroding if Taiwan's dominance of chip production significantly declines? Or do you think this sort of talk of, the US very substantially substituting for Taiwanese production is really just a bit of a fantasy?
I am not sure how likely it is that the US can extricate itself from dependence on semiconductor production in Taiwan. I think if that effort were successful, I do think that there are some foreign policy leaders in the US who would then be willing to sacrifice Taiwan if it weren't for the dependence on semiconductors. But I think there are others who would greatly disagree with that. But when I mentioned the economic considerations, it's not just about the Taiwanese semiconductor industry. If China were to attack Taiwan, what I think we can anticipate is that would shock the U.S. alliance system back into a greater sense of coherence, similar to what we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine. and that there would be significant economic blowback, undermining China's economic ties with the rest of the world. And that would be a major, major cost to China, particularly at a time when they are strengthening economic ties with a lot of existing / erstwhile U.S. allies.
I think Taiwan is of strategic interest to U.S. military planners regardless. It was long before it had a semiconductor industry, and I think it will be, even if that becomes less salient. Even though I agree, I think Taiwan will have good reason to limit the extent to which its semiconductor production is offshored. And so I think probably it will continue to be economically important one way or the other. And even if the United States maybe gain some level of independence, that's not true of the world economy. Current American leadership doesn't seem to care about the world economy in a very robust way. But I think the sort of general elite opinion in the United States understands what a disaster a conflict would be for the operations of global capitalism. And the Chinese leadership 100% does as well. Because China's entire political economy, its entire structure of legitimacy, its ability to maintain all the social pressures in China on a basically stable level, all of that depends on the rest of the world functioning in some basic way as well. And to attack Taiwan would blow up that whole political economy. So I think I agree with Toby. It's really important to step back from the sense that if the United States removed its pressure on China, China would just leap and take Taiwan immediately. I think that's completely wrong. And it's potentially points in the wrong direction, in a counterproductive direction, because it leads American leaders to think we have to increase our ability to intimidate China, increase it ever more and ever more. And it's that dynamic of increasing threat from the United States that makes China respond by increasing its own powers. We get stuck in an arms race, we get stuck in a security dilemma, and both sides increasingly think the other is untrustworthy. They translate the possibility of threat into an assumption that the threat is moving. And I think the most likely way that we end up in a war over Taiwan is simply that these kinds of escalatory dynamics spin out of control, and not because the United States has applied too little pressure.
Just going back to the detail of the summit for a moment. So one topic that seems to have scarcely been discussed is the climate crisis. And Toby, back in November of last year, you wrote a long piece for the Transition Security Project. And in that piece, you wrote that the global transition to clean energy is caught in the middle of intensifying geopolitical conflict between the US and China. The world increasingly relies on China's stunning advances in essential clean energy industries. But these advances and China's rise in economic power have produced a dangerous reaction among US elites. In Washington, China's rise has been interpreted as an intolerable challenge to US primacy and a fundamental threat to US national security, leading to a new era of great power rivalry. The current Trump administration's approach to US-China rivalry has included efforts to form an economic bloc that excludes China, intensifying militarism and an assault on clean energy at home and abroad. These tendencies within the Trump administration threaten the ability of other countries to work with China's clean energy industries and risk a turn towards militarism in the Chinese economy, with devastating consequences for both global stability and global decarbonization. Is that still broadly how you see things today, given the relative thawing in the relationship? But is that more or less how you see it when it comes to the role of the energy transition in US-China relations? And how disappointing is it to see climate scarcely on the agenda of the talks at all?
Obviously, it is bad for the world that the US and China are not discussing the climate crisis. So I guess that is disappointing. I can't imagine that anyone is shocked about that, though, given that Trump is US president. In that article, I tried to identify how there are different tendencies within the Trump administration with different approaches to the US-China relationship. And there are a number of mainstream articles about this now, about how there are many figures in the Trump administration who are China hawks, but there are also some very powerful China doves, Trump being foremost among them, which has been true at least since last October. And I think the sort of dynamic of competing tendencies is still exists. But at the same time, we've obviously been in this truce, a fragile but continuing truce since last fall. I think the other major development, though, it has been the Iran war, which has really supercharged the interest around the world in making the energy transition and necessarily involved a turn to increased consumption of clean tech from China.
Regarding Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, so there was some recent reporting on this in the Financial Times with regard to Marco Rubio's suggestion that China should take responsibility for the situation in the Persian Gulf, given China's friendly relations with Iran. And the reporting included comments from a retired senior army colonel in the People's Liberation Army, who was quoted as saying, "On Iran, China definitely wants to help, but I read what Rubio said. He actually seems to shift the burden to the Chinese side. In China, we have a saying, why should I clean your shit?" Do you think that accurately reflects the view in China? And is she pretty unlikely to do anything significant to pressure the Iranian leadership? And I mean, the fact we've heard almost nothing about it from the talks seems to indicate that.
Yes, no question. But I wouldn't say that this is specific to Iran. China's overall position on foreign security conflicts is that it's willing to help out. It's willing to help mediate. It's willing to help bring different parties to the table. In the past, it used to be willing to come on board for American pressure campaigns against Iran or North Korea. I think that those days are gone, and it's because of the collapse of the U.S.-China relationship, not because of any change in how China thinks about these things. But on the status of Iran right now, I think China is certainly damaged by the disruptions to the global economy. As I said, its entire political economy runs through the global economy. So this is a concern not just for China's domestic economic functioning, which is somewhat insulated because of the degree to which the economy has already transitioned to clean electricity, also significantly insulated because China built up a huge petroleum reserve over the last couple of years. So China's domestic position is relatively secure, but many of its trading partners, particularly Asian trading partners, are experiencing very serious economic problems because of this. And so China doesn't like what's happening here. And the way that China has talked diplomatically about the conflict has been at least as critical of Iranian attacks on the GCC countries, on the other Gulf countries, as it has been on the U.S., even though obviously the U.S. and Israel are far more responsible for this conflict. So I think that is noteworthy, that China is not sort of an anti-imperialist crusader here. China is rather a very pragmatic economic actor. It has a much more significant economic relationship with Saudi Arabia or with United Arab Emirates than it does with Iran. And so in addition to the broader economic damage from the war to the global economy as a whole, China is really invested in trying to return to stability and peace. But I think it's also important to note that China understands quite clearly that an end to the conflict that leaves Iran vulnerable to constantly being attacked by the U.S. and or Israel is not the kind of stability that's going to fix this problem. So I think China is willing to come in on a solution that would achieve the kind of stability that would actually secure its economic interests. But it also understands that that kind of security is only going to happen if the terms are acceptable to Iran. So that means that pressuring Iran China's not avoiding pressuring Iran simply because it wants Iran to win or because it's siding with the attacked country or like whatever motivation you want to fill in there. I think the basic reason China is not going to pressure Iran is that it knows that pressuring Iran will lead to an outcome that doesn't really resolve the problem. All of that said, I think China has already been involved in the diplomacy. It has backed up, Pakistan has been the main mediator, and China has backed up Pakistan in that role. It has responded to Iranian appeals that China be involved because China's the only very powerful country that might give Iran a sense that its interests are being respected in the whole process. So China is already involved, and I think it would be willing to step up its involvement in certain ways, but not in ways that lead to the capitulation of Iran to U.S. demands.
Going back to the question of parity and Chinese intentions vis-a-vis the United States. So I imagine you will both have seen an article by Julian Gewirtz that appeared in the New York Times. Gewirtz is now at Columbia University, but was senior director for China and Taiwan affairs at the National Security Council. In his piece in the New York Times, he argued that Mao's On Protracted War, the Chinese leader's 1938 tract that laid out his strategy for defeating the occupying Japanese forces, he argued that this continues to inform Chinese thinking when it comes to strategic competition with the United States. And in the piece, Gewirtz writes that the enduring resonance of On Protracted War in China today reflects Mao's dictum of making the past serve the present. Decades-old historical and ideological references remain central to how the Communist Party legitimizes its political, economic, and strategic goals and mobilizes the country to achieve them. Mr. Xi appears to see the competition with the United States through the same prism of long-term struggle that Mao developed to guide Chinese strategy almost a century ago. He and other top officials have invoked the essay as a guide for responding to economic and strategic challenges. What did you make of the essay and these claims about the supposed continuities in the way that China approaches geopolitics?
Yeah, I think that Xi Jinping relies on the works of Mao Zedong the same way that Trump relies on the Bible. And I'm quite serious about that. I think that when these like sacred texts are useful for what he wants to do, then he will employ them. And he will use them as a reference point to orient his. So I think there were two claims in the section that you read there that are confused together. There's one claim that these texts are shaping the thinking and the motivation and the goals, strategy of the leadership. And the other claim is that the leadership uses these texts as a way of legitimating what it wants to do. And I think the first is wrong and the second is right. And it's quite clear that the Chinese leadership does not think that they are in a war with the United States. They think the United States is mistakenly pushing them in that direction. But they continue to have hopes, I think, that it need not become an open conflict with the United States, that there should be enough space in the global system for both countries if the United States can just step back from its aggressive attacks on China's growing economic and diplomatic power. So I think that it just at a fundamental level, it's different. That Mao Zedong knew quite well. And in fact, Mao Zedong's whole orientation was towards conflict within the party, conflict with the Kuomintang, conflict with the Japanese. He was always in conflict with people who he couldn't dominate. And that's not really the way that Xi Jinping sees the world. Xi Jinping wants to have kind of a system that is stable. He's a control freak. He wants people to do what he wants, but more than anything, he wants something predictable and stable.
And does that, in some sense, with a more historical framing, represent the way in which the contemporary Communist Party is really, in some sense, a repudiation of the Cultural Revolution and that aspect of Mao's legacy?
Yes, no question. But I think it needs to be understood as a specific kind of repudiation, because you can repudiate in a lot of ways. So like the neoliberal reformists of the 90s were repudiating the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping is doing something quite different. He is rebuilding state power. He is centralizing control in his own hands. He's disciplining the party apparatus. He's repressing critics, but he's also trying to be responsive to the criticisms by attacking corruption, by modestly reducing inequality and insecurity in the country. That's the approach. And this is all in service to establishing social stability and overcoming the fragmentation in the Chinese system that had built up over the neoliberal era that made it very hard for the party to manage any kind of reforms, to change the way that the economy works. And this was meant to tackle a whole range of problems, such as the property bubble, such as local corruption that was leading to a lot of popular dissatisfaction, such as rich people flaunting their wealth that was threatening to delegitimize the party. So this is directed at a whole range of primarily domestic problems. But as U.S. hostility has grown, it's also been then directed externally to try to stabilize the external environment.
I feel like invoking this 1938 text I feel like this kind of thing serves as a way for U.S. foreign policy elites to tell themselves that China and Xi Jinping is like incorrigibly committed to conflict with the United States and is fundamentally oriented towards taking us down, which I think is just the wrong way to approach U.S.-China tensions. Like, the tensions are real, but I think they're also more manageable, and that it's possible to overcome them in a way that you would think is not possible if you thought that somehow Xi Jinping is just following a playbook that was set in the Chinese Communist Party in 1938 or something like that. So I don't know if that Gewurz is like trying to make that argument, but I feel like that's how this kind of discourse often functions in U.S. elite circles. I think, just to pick up on Jake's point about how the thing that Xi Jinping is oriented towards is not conflict, but stability. I find it interesting to look at a lot of the statements that come from Chinese officials about what they would like to see in the international order and the changes that they would like to see in global governance, which is also reflected in like statements from the BRICS, where China is the most significant power, and their vision is like pretty status quo, and particularly with Trump in power, China's positioning itself as the status quo global power in contrast with U.S. revisionism. They talk about maintaining the existing multilateral system. They talk about the importance of the UN, but also these U.S.-led institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, that they talk about the need to maintain these institutions, continue to work through them to increase their legitimacy. And they have some suggestions.
And sorry, Toby, I mean, that's very interesting, isn't it? I suppose, in the sense that those institutions increasingly seem to be institutions of a prior period and to have very little relevance to the current situation. It's interesting that they're sort of determined to kind of hang on to them.
But these are the institutions of globalization, and globalization has been extremely important for China. So it makes sense that China would remain committed to these institutions in that way. And you also see like other BRICS countries also go for that. So, it's a commitment to the status quo, but with reforms. But it is very different from a vision of like all out war against the U.S. and U.S.-led institutions, which is a narrative that you will encounter, in D.C. and whatnot.
Aside from crises that can't easily be predicted, and if we know anything about our current situation, is that there's some crisis that we haven't expected that is probably coming for us. But aside from that, what do you see on the horizon that's more visible that might potentially sour the relationship, which at least for the moment seems to be on a somewhat less hostile footing, as we've discussed?
Something that is definitely building up is the way that the United States is targeting Chinese interests in third countries. And we saw that in the way that the U.S. strong-armed Panama into evicting these Hong Kong companies that ran part of the port infrastructure at the Panama Canal. We see that in a lot of job owning about various Chinese projects in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile. We see that in the way that the Venezuela intervention was justified, even though I don't think that was the reason it happened. China was brought in as a rationalization of why the United States had to do this. We see it in the trade agreements that Trump struck with particularly Southeast Asian countries that more or less gave the United States a veto over Chinese projects in those countries. We see it in a lot of the critical minerals deals that Trump is making. For example, the DRC basically gave up its sovereignty over minerals to Trump, at least nominally, in the deal it struck. And that was also quite explicitly aimed at China's position of dominance in critical minerals extraction. So like with the technology restrictions that Trump 1 set off and Biden systematized, China has been warning that this is not acceptable, but it hasn't really done anything. Some very limited and kind of like petty. It's like not letting Panama flagged ships land in Chinese ports, but it's very limited. Nothing of great consequence yet. But what I expect to happen is that China will assemble the machinery to be able to impose some real pain on the United States for this stuff as it continues. And it should be noted that even as Trump clearly wants to maintain basic stability in the relationship, even as he doesn't have this kind of ideological opposition to China or the sense that we have to diminish China in order to rebuild our own primacy that really characterizes the U.S. foreign policy establishment. His way of operating is also sort of unilateral assertion of dominance. He's not trying to run a system like the U.S. foreign policy establishment is. He actually wants to rip up that system because it's constraining American power. But that means that he will use unilateral assertions of dominance in ways that could also be extremely threatening to China, even if Trump is not motivated specifically by a desire to hurt China. So it's these kinds of frictions that I think are going to continue to build up and will eventually lead China to act in ways that call the issue. And then there's always a question, is some friction in the relationship going to be, because there are so many China hawks in the administration, anytime there's a friction in the relationship, they have an opening to go to Trump and say, look, China's taking you for a ride. We've got to put a stop to this, and we've got to act in a confrontational manner to make sure that they stop. And that really worked during the trade war in the first Trump term. And even though Trump himself didn't want to unfold a kind of all-around warfare against China to restrict it and prevent it from growing, he was open to the people in his administration who wanted to do that, because whenever the negotiations started stumbling, then he looked for new sources of leverage. So if we do get into a situation where negotiations really start moving, and then we run into some problems in it, it's very possible that Trump could turn to some new form of leverage that might call this issue even sooner.
Yeah, I think the pressure on third countries, a lot of that is what I discussed in that article you mentioned from last year in the Transition Security Project. Those are the efforts being made by officials within the Trump administration that there are tools that could push us towards the formation of closed blocks. And there are, like I mentioned in the article, a number of officials in the Trump administration who do hold to that kind of vision. And I think this stuff is happening without Trump really understanding that this stuff could blow up the U.S.-China relationship that he currently feels very warmly about. And I think Trump is, his mind is too far gone for him to understand dynamics that are this subtle. I think we should also be wary of what happens post-Trump. So like we've been talking about, plenty of China hawks in the Republican Party, aside from Trump. We also need to look at what Democrats are planning for, particularly the foreign policy leaders within the Democratic Party establishment, and where U.S. Capitol is on all this. So there are divisions within U.S. Capitol, but one thing I noted was a recent report from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce warning about the economic threat from Chinese industry, not just to the U.S., but all G7 countries, and sort of gesturing towards the idea that they would like more coordinated action among the entire G7 against this threat from, China Shock 2.0, and very unclear about what steps they would like all these countries to take together. But it's consistent with some plans that we see from some thinkers on the Democratic Party side about, post-Trump, we're going to form a bigger, more powerful bloc against China and take much more coordinated action to, contain that threat.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/poletheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.